We're coming up on the end of 2024, and Kamala Harris may have just suggested that the estate tax exemption could come down to $3.5 million per person in 2025 or 2026. What does that mean for you? Hi, I'm John Strohmeyer with Strohmeyer Law, where we help our clients leave no unfinished business. Now, I am an attorney, but I'm not your attorney, so make sure that when you're doing your own planning, you talk to your own advisor. Don't just listen to some talking head on the internet. Now, we're in the middle of a presidential election. We're also set to have a reduction in the estate tax exemption values that are planned and currently in law at the end of 2025. Right now, here in 2024, it's $13.61 million per person. It's adjusted for inflation, meaning it's going to tick up to probably $14.25 million per person next year before it drops to be about $7.5 million or so in 2026. The estate tax exemption has been $10 million adjusted for inflation every year since 2011. But starting in 2026, instead of being $10 million adjusted for inflation from 2011, it's going to be $5 million adjusted for inflation. So we've got things going up and up and up, and then it's going to drop in 2026 when the starting point is not $10 million, but $5 million. That means that we'll have 14 million or so per person in 2026, dropping to $7.5 or so million per person in 2025 into 2026. That bonus exemption, well, if you haven't used it, then it should just go away. That means, well, people are thinking about how can you use that? To use it, well, you've got to gift through all of that exemption that's going to be left. So you don't start with the exemption that's going to go away. You've got to burn through that 7.5 that'll be left, meaning that people have to look at making gifts of at least $7.5 to $8 million before you start using that bonus exemption. A lot of people, I was just talking to clients earlier today when I said, well, it's a minimum of an $8 million gift. They just kind of got big-eyed and said, no, we're not going to be doing that. Well, what happens if Kamala Harris is elected? She's recently signed on to Elizabeth Warren's plan. Her proposal is potentially for a $3.5 million per person exemption. No word on if that's adjusted for inflation or not. Obviously, that's going to bring that down a whole lot more. Should clients be panicking? Well, who knows? First things first, we don't know when or even if this will get passed. For things as they stand right now, the exemption is slated to come down to that $7.5 million or so in 2026. Congress doesn't have to do anything. The president doesn't have to sign anything. That will happen if nobody does anything. So there's a bias for that to happen because it doesn't take anything for that to happen. For things to come down to $3.5 million per person, that will take a quite literal act of Congress. So what that means is you will have notice, and it's not going to be something that's going to be effective January 1, 2025. So the time to panic is not just yet. Does that mean that people won't try and sell you on panicking now to get things done before who knows what happens? No, of course not. People are going to press the panic button. They're going to try and get you to buy in on that panic as well. Right now, look, I could be wrong on this. I've said this before multiple times. The estate tax exemption changes have always been prospective. They have not done anything in the past. They've not done any retroactive changes, meaning I don't expect them to make a retroactive proposal for this as well. Yeah, when Bernie Sanders introduced his proposal for $3.5 million back in 2021, it was going to be prospective, meaning you'd have at least the rest of the year, rest of 2021 before it went into effect in 2022. That bill went nowhere. And that's kind of how I think this will go here as well. At worst, well, they'll probably do nothing. I don't know if there's going to be enough support for changing that exemption to really take any hold. Again, I'm using my crystal ball, which isn't great. It's like everybody else's. I'm going to make some choices, but we need to really see what goes through this year in the election and know what sort of makeup you'll have in the House next year, what makeup you'll have in the Senate, and who will be president before we can say anything about what needs to be done for estate tax planning. But once we know that, what are we going to do to start thinking through who gets what and how they're going to get it? How are we going to deal with this estate tax planning? Well, estate tax planning comes down to playing a game of how do we pay the least amount of tax when we have two real levers we can pull. Lever one, reducing the assets that are subject to estate tax. Game two, making sure you have the cash available to pay that tax that will be due. Obviously, having the cash available to pay tax is less great. Obviously, paying tax is our second best option, but the reason we want to think about paying the tax is to make sure that we at least are not in a cash crunch where you have to sell assets to try and scrape up the payment. So, game one, how do we reduce your assets? Well, first thing we can do, obviously, is just giving it away. There's the annual exclusion, so that's the $18,000 per person per year, where we're giving that away. And while on a single $18,000 gift, when you're facing potentially millions of dollars in tax, that's not going to do much. It's the steady drip of that, making multiple gifts to multiple people over multiple years. That'll start reducing that down. Under the current rates, well, 40% of that $18,000 ends up being saved estate tax. Of course, it means you've given those assets away. The good news is when you make those annual exclusion gifts, you're not using up any of that estate tax exemption. So that 13.61 million here in 2024, it's not going down. But what if you want to make gifts that are bigger than that $18,000 annual exclusion? This is where the unified credit amount, the 13.61 million exemption comes in. By using that amount, you're actually saying, I'm going to make this gift now. And we're going to make a gift using today's values, thinking that the estate tax value that it would be valued at on my death would be significantly higher. And so you're giving it away, you're using up some of that credit now, thinking that when you calculate your estate tax later, you'd rather have used up the credit at today's values rather than include the future value of that asset so that the appreciation is gifted away and is not subject to estate tax in your estate. Essentially, you'd rather give that away. The downside of this is you're giving it away at whatever your current basis is, meaning that your beneficiaries will take the basis when they go and either sell the asset, potentially depreciate it. They're going to have to use that lower amount of whatever it is today and not get the benefit of any sort of basis step up when you die. It's a game that you're looking at. Well, can you afford to give things away? Should you give it away? Will it impact your life by giving this away? There's not a right answer. Everybody needs to think about it because we're talking about saying goodbye to things. Once you give that to your kids, wave goodbye. It's theirs, not yours. The second thing to think about is providing some way to pay for this. Now, this is where life insurance usually comes in, because if you're sure you're going to be paying estate tax when you pass away, well, life insurance is there. It is one way of providing liquidity. Another way would just be having the cash on hand. The thing to think about with this is you want to make sure that you're holding these assets in such a way that it's not going to provide an additional tax burden. The big problem with life insurance, though, is if you own it in your own name and you have it payable to your estate or somewhere else, well, by owning that policy, the problem is that you're going to be taxed on the proceeds as well. So if you buy a $1 million policy, it's going to be subject to estate tax when you die. Well, you're really only netting out $600,000 under the current 40% estate tax. So this is where the life insurance trusts come in. By having someone who is a separate person own that policy as trustee of the trust, then you can make sure that the life insurance proceeds are there for the benefit of your beneficiaries. They can take those proceeds, use it to pay the tax, loan it out to sell assets perhaps. By having that in place, you've got the liquidity to be able to make the estate tax payment. So again, pulling things together. Right now, we're still not sure what things are going to look like or if they're even going to change for estate tax purposes in 2025 or even into 2026. This year's election will drive a lot of those changes if they even happen. Beyond that, when we're playing the game of how do we reduce estate tax, well, the two levers that we have, one, reducing assets by making gifts so that fewer assets are subject to estate tax, either by giving them away in a way that we don't use up your credit, or by making larger gifts, larger taxable gifts that you think are going to go up significantly in value so that the appreciation is not subject to estate tax. The other way to address estate tax is to make sure that your family has the liquidity necessary to pay that tax bill. Get Not that we want to pay the tax, but sometimes we know it's going to happen. So we're planning ahead to make sure that we have the liquidity there to not force a cash crunch on the family. So thanks so much for watching. Remember to talk to your own advisors about your particular situation. We'll see you next time.